Yo, what's up? It's someone that's no one, and welcome back to another story mix. Today I wanted to gather some stories with the plant Brugmansia and show what it can be like, how much of a poison at times it can be. Also known as Angel's Trumpet, this is in the Solanaceae family, the same as Datura, and this is also the first substance we've ever had a trip report on. And also, we did cover this not too long ago in a Substance Explained episode. We go in depth and break down what exactly it is and how it works in that episode, so I do highly recommend you go check that out before or after this. But it is a deliriant. It contains tropane alkaloids, so if ingested, a pretty horrifying experience can ensue. Many people just know about Datura, but there's a whole world of deliriants out there, and we cover this one a lot, so I really just wanted to highlight this plant. I feel like this will pair well with that Substance Explained episode, so I'll probably have that link below. And also in this, I'm throwing a really cool Patreon exclusive report, so this will have some new content and it'll be a good one. Anyways, I hope you get some insight from these and enjoy. So without further ado, let's dive right into this. A demonized drug. For nearly 2 years, I have had quite a fascination with solanaceous plants. I read everything I could find on Daturas, Brugmansias, nightshade, and the like. I had experimented with small doses of Brugmansia and smaller of Datura to little effect. A dry throat and tired, dilated pupils. I finally decided to really give it a try and ate 100 seeds. About 20 on the hour and then 40 or so at once. I also smoked about a dozen. I then ate 2 Datura leaves and 2 Brugmansia leaves. I noticed very little until I decided to go to bed at about 11:30. After a while not sleeping, as sometimes I get very bad insomnia, I decided to read a book. I sat up in bed and began to read some readily available story. I can't now recall what it was about, but I found it very interesting. Ironically, I was reminded of a Datura report here at Yierba called the Infinity Book. I then looked away from the book and looked back, and there was nothing there except my hands, palms up as if I was holding a book. Wow, I thought. That was one nifty hallucination. I didn't feel at all high at the time, no confusion or delirium. I continued to lay in bed as people I know streamed through my door one at a time. They would either face away from me when I tried to converse with them, or just stare blankly at me and smile or giggle once in a while. A close friend of mine walked in at one point and stared at me coldly while I asked her how she was that night. For some reason, I would always try to start small talk with these people, even though I sorta knew they weren't really there. She then proceeded to crawl up onto my desk and assume a fetal position for several minutes before disappearing. One thing that happened throughout the experience was me trying to grab things that weren't there. I would be thirsty and reach for a water bottle, only to have my hand go right through it. I would try and adjust my pillow or retrieve a blanket, but my hand would slide right through them. It became really irritating. Several other strange things happened that night, such as seeing what looked like hundreds of large black rodents scurrying around my floor and watching a television that I found not to be on, similar to the book thing. All in all, it was a very nice experience. Very strange, but sort of comforting and not at all scary. Garden of Eden. One day, I was walking near my house and walked down a street where I knew a few Brugmansia plants were growing in someone's front yard. I picked a small, young leaf out the top of the largest plants, chewed it up a bit, and left it under my tongue to absorb subliminally. I then walked to a park and meditated a bit. I thought I could feel a vague effect, but wasn't sure. When I left the park, I walked back past the plants and picked and chewed another small young leaf on my way home. I thought I had some slight euphoria. Also, my skin felt somewhat itchy and had the smallest amount of dryness. Both symptoms I knew were associated with Datura and Brugmansia. Still though, I wasn't sure how much was just a placebo. A few days later, after reading more about different ways to administer the plant, I walked back down the same street, and this time I collected one flower that had fallen off the largest plant and dried on the soil. I put this flower in my bag and walked back home. I made a pipe by poking holes in an orange. The pipe had a small bowl, so I had to keep packing and repacking the bowl with crushed pieces of the flower. It felt almost nauseating to inhale the smoke. After I had smoked the whole flower in my backyard, I went inside and laid on the couch. I definitely felt the onset of a relaxing body high, but from what I could tell, had very little visual or perceptual effects. Mostly, I just zoned out with this heavy relaxed body high and watched some YouTube videos. After around 20 minutes, I stood up to get some water, and this is when I really noticed how sedated I felt. My skin felt more sensitive than usual, but at the same time, I felt a slow, earthy calm, and a subtle absence of thought. This lasted for around an hour as it slowly wore off. July 2nd, 2020. About 1 week later, I was walking around the neighborhood with my friend. Let's call him Kevin. It was near a full moon, and I had read that the levels of active chemicals in Brugmansia rise and fall with the moon. I mentioned to Kevin that there was a plant a few blocks over that you could trip on. Kevin isn't that interested in drugs, but he still went with me to the Brugmansia plants. Again, I poked a young, light green leaf off the plant and chewed on it. This time, I swallowed it. We walked to the park. There is something about the taste of Brugmansia leaves that really lets you know it is full of potent chemicals. We sat for a few minutes at the park, and even though it wasn't enough time for the leaf to be absorbed in my stomach, I could still feel that relaxed, almost empty feeling again. Something about that feeling is very attractive to me. I decided I want to eat more of it. At this point, I don't think Kevin fully believed that the plant did anything at all, so he scanned it with an app that identifies plants. As he was scanning it, I ate 2 more small leaves, and maybe because he was becoming interested, he picked 2 leaves as well, but didn't eat them. He started reading that it was called Angel's Trumpet, another name for Brugmansia. He noted that it is highly toxic and can cause death. At this point, I think he started to worry and asked me if I was feeling okay. The effects were still mild, and I wasn't fully sure they were just a placebo. We started walking back to my house, and I asked him if he was going to eat the 2 leaves he picked. They were about 3.5 to 4 inches long, much larger than the small young ones I had been eating, and also darker green. He said no, and so I asked him if I can have them. He said, "Are you sure I can give you these?" and then reluctantly handed them to me. I rolled them up into a tight cylinder and started chewing. The taste was very strong. I had to pick a plum off a nearby tree to chase the taste with. The walk back was about 15 minutes. Kevin works in real estate, so he's always stopping at random houses and asking the owners if they want to sell. He was stopped at a house, so I decided to walk back home before him. I was starting to think that I had just imagined the effects because nothing was changing that much. I got back home and walked into my room where my girlfriend was lying in bed. This is the first moment where something felt strange. She looked at me like something about me was different. She asked if I was okay and then said, "What happened to your eye? It's really red." I was guessing I had touched my eye after handling the leaves and some of the poison had gotten into my eye. I think I flushed my eye out with water after that. I lay down next to my girlfriend. The relaxed body high sensation started to increase. Also, my speech became a little impaired and things were slightly different perceptually. Still, all the effects seemed mild and were mostly producing a giggly, relaxed high. I'm not sure how long I was chilling with my girlfriend for when she asked if my friend Kevin was still here. I thought I should go into the living room and check, so I got up. Standing up was difficult. It felt like weights had been strapped to my body and my legs were made of jello. Walking to the door felt like I was wading through water, and I had to shuffle my feet across the ground to move. The effects at this time, however, didn't feel much more significant than being moderately to heavily drunk, so I wasn't startled. I walked into the living room and attempted to act normal while interacting with Kevin. This was impossible. He was sitting at the dining table, and I just collapsed into a chair and burst out laughing. My speech was slurred, and everything felt like it was slowed down. The feeling was still manageable and also felt similar to being drunk, but I started to be in disbelief at how much these plant leaves were affecting me. Kevin took a picture of me with his laptop and sent it to his girlfriend, who said I looked swollen. My skin had a reddish hue and my face looked puffy. The body sensation of being weighed down and pulled into a sleep state started to get intense. In a moment of bravado, I stood up, shuffled over to the packed bong on the fireplace, and took a bong rip. I told Kevin that I needed to just go to sleep, as my body sensations were getting so strong. My perception more and more felt like I was in a dream. I waddled back into my room. I said something to my girlfriend about needing to sleep, and my speech felt heavily impaired and altered. I lay down. I fell asleep instantly and also started dreaming instantly. The dream was 100% realistic, and I was in an auto parts store surrounded by people of South American heritage. I opened my eyes and looked at my girlfriend, but couldn't move at all. The scene in my room was no more or less real than what I would see when I closed my eyes again and slipped back into whatever dream. Again, I opened my eyes and couldn't move. I had to jerk myself awake to move. I looked into my girlfriend's face, and this was the most terrifying experience of my life. There she was, and there was my room, but it completely looked like a dream, and it totally didn't seem real. This is when the overwhelming feeling that I had fucked up washed over me. I started feeling all the symptoms I had read would happen when taking Datura and Brugmansia. My mouth was as dry as a desert, drier than anything I had ever experienced. It was like the mouth of a corpse. My skin felt hot, itchy, tight, and it was a reddish yellow. The room seemed dark and sinister, like something impossibly evil was there. I stood up and started seizing. The tremors would just shake through my body with no remorse. I stumbled to the bathroom and profusely vomited in the toilet 8 or 9 times. I remember realizing that, even though I had vomited, so much poison was already in my system that I might die. I just knelt there in front of the toilet, literally praying for my life as my entire reality crumbled around me. The sensation of being pulled into a permanent death sleep was so strong that I was convinced that if I fell asleep, I would go into a coma and die. I stood up and told my girlfriend in my garbled, barely functioning speech that I wanted to go walk around outside so I would keep from passing out and dying. I kept shaking and having muscle spasms as I put on my jacket. It was getting dark now, and my girlfriend and I walked outside. I saw Kevin drive off in his car as he said, "Looking good," which totally confused me because I felt like hell. While he made me feel a bit better until I took a step onto a concrete square on the sidewalk, and the square sunk down into the earth about 1.5 feet and made it sound like an old stone button moving in like a trapdoor in Indiana Jones. As soon as this happened, I stumbled and a sense of terror flowed over me. I looked back and the concrete square hadn't moved. I looked down the street and could see black shadowy beast moving around in someone's front yard. The whole sidewalk was covered in a shimmering translucent gel honeycomb that turned into cheetah spots and other shapes as it connected to trees and bushes growing out of the ground. Everyone I saw looked like they were walking around like zombies or they were dead. I crossed the street and the black asphalt looked like an infinite void into hell, full of tiny white lines forming weird tightly knit geometry. Every couple of minutes, one or the other of my legs would go out and I would almost fall, losing complete control of my body. I started thinking that there were interdimensional entities around me and they were waiting for me to die so they could steal my body. I had to stop in the middle of the sidewalk and meditate while making mudra shapes with my hands to create an energy field around my body and keep from dying. I continued around the block, back to my house, and pretty much felt like a 90-year-old man with severe dementia going for a walk. I got back home and I lost perception of time. My phone said it was 10:30 p.m. and the effects were still very strong. At one point, I was sitting on my couch, wishing it would stop, when I noticed my hands were really swollen, to the point where I could barely close my fist. I thought that the effects might actually be getting stronger, so I peed more and drank more. This is when I realized I couldn't pee, and my penis had shrunk in size considerably. Not being able to pee at all when you know your bladder is full is one of the most terrifying and painful experiences. After excruciating effort, I was able to dribble out a few drops of pee. It was probably around 11 p.m. when I called the poison control hotline and asked if I was going to die. The guy didn't seem too concerned and said something like, "People do this every day." I still wanted to stay awake because I thought I was going to die if I went to sleep, but my girlfriend said she would watch me and make sure I didn't stop breathing, so I decided to just lay down and try to go to sleep. Besides having to get up a few times to take an agonizing leak, One of the last things I remember was lying in bed, looking close up at my fingers, and seeing all these little white fibers dancing around on my skin. The more I looked, the more I realized my whole body was made of these little thin, flickering white, hair-like fibers. I closed my eyes, and instead of the usual dream visuals, I only saw a few things. Staticky images flashing in a small area of my vision, while the rest was just a jet black. I wondered if these were my last brain cells dying, and if I was going to be impaired forever. As I fell asleep, I kept having vivid dreams of lying in bed, looking at my phone, or thinking that my girlfriend's hand was on my hand, and it had gone totally numb, or thinking my girlfriend was someone else. When I woke up the next day, I felt pretty much normal. Actually, I felt sort of refreshed, and my skin seemed rejuvenated. A few days later, I was able to take and pass a real estate exam, so I don't think I permanently damaged my brain. My girlfriend was obviously distraught with witnessing my near demise. I promised her I'd never eat Brugmansia again. However, as the weeks passed, and I kept reading more about it, I couldn't curb my interest. For the past few days, I've been walking by the plants in my neighborhood and eating 1 or 2 small young leaves, just enough to get the medicinal effect. La Yierba del Diablo. I had read about Datura in Carlos Castaneda's book, The Teachings of Don Juan, and could not believe that the plant was hallucinogenic. At the time, I was very naive and had no experience with drugs of any kind. Still don't, and almost killed myself that way. I broke a whole branch off a tree Datura, Brugmansia, and took it home where I made a little salad out of it, chopped the leaves, mixed with some olive oil, and started eating it. The taste was awful, very bitter. Thankfully, I only had 2 or 3 mouthfuls, and then I sat down and started reading the Sunday paper. About 20-30 minutes later, I started seeing the whole room in red color, as if looking through a sheet of red plastic. I tried to focus on the Sunday paper's classified, and much to my horror, all the news was dated back to the late 1800s and were about slaves being sold, traded, etc. The paper looked very authentic, sepia tone and all, and no pictures like modern papers have. Then I turned the page and saw one picture of a female slave, whom I somehow knew was myself, attached to a torture pole, being whipped and bleeding. When I tried to focus on the picture, the slave turned her head and looked at me. I freaked out, left the apartment, and took a taxi to my grandmother's house. She sent for my oldest uncle, who was a shaman. This happened in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. But he wasn't home, and I just returned home by myself. That night, they took me back to see my uncle, and he didn't find anything unusual with me because I never mentioned I had eaten the leaves of Brugmansia. So I went back home and lay down in bed next to my husband and went to sleep. In the middle of the night, probably about 1 a.m., I woke up, turned around, and instead of my husband, I find his skeleton lying down next to me. I screamed at the top of my lungs and woke up my parents. We were spending the night at their place, and would not stop screaming until they came and told my husband to leave the room. From that night on, I could not look at my husband without seeing him involved in red color, and somehow I felt like he had a demonic presence in him, and I would always scream until someone would come and take him out of the room. The next day, my parents took me to a doctor who happened to be a Japanese neurologist who was famous for dealing with teenagers and young people having psychological problems. I don't know what he prescribed, but I remember reading the labels and telling my parents that I was not going to take that stuff because it was probably too strong for me. They insisted though, because it had been prescribed by a doctor and was supposed to stop my wandering around. Still to this day, I do not know what he prescribed to me, but I got 100% worse and ended up in a psychiatric hospital about 6 weeks later. During those 6 weeks, I had several hallucinations about the devil, and I would feel his presence very close to me, sometimes licking my face and my ears, sometimes whipping me with his tail, but I never saw a face, only the body from the waist down, which looked like it belonged to an animal, black, shiny fur, and 2 goat-like feet. One time, I was lying in a hammock in my mom's yard, being closely watched by her and my aunt. and I got up all of a sudden, saying that a horrible storm was approaching, and I could feel the wind, the dust, and very heavy rain fall all over me, while I felt totally blind. My mom and her sister walked me back to the hammock and made me lie down, and then I could not move anymore. Now I was blind and paralyzed. I couldn't move a finger. They decided to take me to their spiritualist church in the evening, and I remember being led there totally blind. But after about 5 minutes of being there, I started regaining my vision and movements. When people who knew me since I was little came to talk to me, I never answered them and just begged my parents to take me back home. Then my mom took me to one of her prayer partners' house for praying. I asked for a glass of water, and when the lady came back with the water, I just threw the whole thing on her face. Every time she looked at me earlier, I could see her twisting her face and her eyes in mockery, so that was my way of responding to that. She held me by the arm and walked me over to a big picture of Christ hanging on her wall, and said a few words in the sense that whomever was trying to take over me had to know that Christ was the Father, etc., etc. I remember regaining consciousness immediately after that. Then on a Sunday, one of my brother's friends came to visit, and when I looked at her face, the flesh started falling off as if it was rotten, and I was terrified and again screamed at the top of my lungs until someone took the girl away from the room. I remember having the same hallucination when looking at a magazine cover and also looking at myself in the mirror, which made me avoid mirrors for a long time. In the meantime, my parents kept taking me to the neurologist doctor who kept drugging me more and more, totally oblivious to the descriptions of my parents about my condition. At this time, I had been practically locked up in my parents' home, but anytime anyone came to visit, I would try to escape and would run straight into traffic. I guess I was trying to kill myself. Then for a while, the hallucination stopped, and I was allowed to go back to my own apartment with my husband. But one night, he woke up and found me on the window of the 6th floor. I was taken down and went back to my parents' house. I remember clearly waking up in the middle of the night, hearing a very insistent voice telling me to climb on the windowsill and jump off. I did what the voice was telling me to do, not without much hesitation, but the voice was stronger than my will. I remember that it was cold, and I decided to grab a blanket to cover my shoulders before climbing on the window, and apparently that's what startled my husband and made him wake up and grab me before I jumped off. Back at my parents', I went on seeing people's flesh fall off their faces or them turn into apes right before my eyes, and whenever that happened, I wanted to run down the street to escape that vision. One day, I did succeed and ran away, but when I got around the block, I saw a lady that owned a cafe in my parents' neighborhood and decided to sit down and have a chat with her. My mom had come down the street trying to catch me when she saw her brother's car approach, and she asked him to go after me. They found me sitting at the cafe peacefully, chatting with the lady owner, and put me in my uncle's car and took me back to the neurologist's office for one more visit. By this time, I was equating the doctor's office to a place linked with death for some reason, and I remember walking down the entrance with my uncle, holding my arm, but the minute I opened the door and stepped into the office, I saw myself alone in an empty room with a coffin lying in the middle of it. When I looked inside of it, there was my uncle lying in it, dead. I screamed again and took off to the streets. The doctor's office was in an older neighborhood and had 6 feet high iron gates with spikes around it. I remember climbing the gate and jumping on the street with my uncle trying to grab me. I ran, as always, right onto the busiest traffic, and when I was about to step into it, I saw a guy standing on the curb. He looked at me and, calling me by my name, said, "Go back to your uncle." He had a very assertive smile on his face, so I decided to obey him and just turned around and went back to my uncle, who was running down the street trying to catch me. After this incident, my parents decided to take me to see a psychiatrist. Then I knew that would be the end, and I fought against it. They had to have 3 or 4 people grab me and lock me up in my dad's car for the 1-hour ride to the psychiatrist's office. When we arrived, I realized that my husband and my brother were also meeting with a psychiatrist, and as soon as the meeting started, I just stripped right in front of everybody and went from person to person, asking them if they wanted to fuck me. In my mind, I had been taken there to be fertilized by the devil, a la Rosemary's Baby, so I just decided to go ahead and be done with it. I thought that maybe if I seduced one of those people, my own husband, my dad, and brother, that would somehow keep me from being raped by the devil. The psychiatrist told my parents to lock me up, and they did. He told me I would be in for at least 6 months, and after I went in, the hallucinations went on. One time, I looked out of the hospital's window and saw a river of fire coming down the concrete steps of the property, and in the middle of all the fire, there were all these mad dogs, barking and being pushed down the river of fire. Simply horrible. Neither the doctors nor my family knew what I had taken, but somehow the one in charge of me decided to do a detox, and that saved my life. 2 weeks later, I was out of the hospital, and it took me at least 2 years of therapy, without any medication though, with an orthodox Freudian doctor, the same one that had me detoxed, for me going back to having a normal life. I agree with one of the people that described their experience that this herb aims to kill, and after regaining consciousness, I had heard several stories of people killing themselves after drinking the tea. I guess I was extremely lucky to come out of the experience alive, because I felt all the time that if I died under the effect, my soul was going to be in the devil's service to act on other people who took the herb. It was more or less like how this other guy describes it, that it seems like once you die under the effect of Datura, you belong to an evil group and you can never free yourself again. By the way, my mom said right after I was put in the hospital, my uncle, the shaman, had a session for me in the middle of the forest, and told her that she could rest assured that I would be out of the hospital in no time, not in 6 months as predicted, and that I would be safe after that. That all happened in 1979. The year is now 2000, and I still haven't fully recovered from that experience. Whatever the temptation is, watch out. Don't do it. Had it been now, and in America, I would have sued the neurologist who prescribed all those drugs and never had a clue that I was intoxicated. It could have cost me my life. The plant alone, though, has claimed many lives, and it hasn't been funny. So, don't go there. Three weeks in its reality. I first approached Brugmansia with great trepidation and expectation. However, my first experiences were disappointing. Smoked leaves had no effect. Smoked flowers caused a slight shift in perception with pupil dilation and no hallucinations. Raw leaves and flowers can cause stomach pain or vomiting. My preferred method of consuming raw plant material is to chew it for several minutes, then spit out the pulp. I use this method with alcohol. 4 large leaves are enough to induce a mild sedation with a heavy/floppy body sensation without delusions. Pulped plant material was rubbed into my body, absorbing the atropine and scopolamine externally. I tried this method because I was too anxious about eating plant material or drinking tea. During application, some fluid entered my left eye, causing long-term dilation and permanently deteriorated vision. This caused a minor shift in perception without hallucinations. Having tried every other method of ingestion, I wanted to try tea. I almost certainly drank too much because I was in a drunken-like stupor for 3 weeks while my dead best friend gave running commentary on my daily activities. This changed my life. I boiled 2 liters of water and added 16 finely chopped flowers, approximately 30 leaves, and a few thick stems. After straining, I shared 660 milliliters between 3 people, my friends Oliver, Dave, and Matt. The rest was frozen. The earthy brown liquid tasted bland and went down effortlessly. It didn't have any of the jelly-like gooiness of mushroom tea. We decided to vaporize some cannabis, eat some space cake, and then take a drive while it took effect. Around 30 minutes after ingestion, a dreamy sedation set in with free-falling sensations similar to ketamine or nutmeg, sort of like I was sinking into my seat. The same mundane views I see every day seemed outstanding, as if I were looking at them for the first time with the brightness turned up 10 times. I tried to drop my friends off at home so I could meditate back at my apartment without any distractions, but when Matt opened the car door, he collapsed headfirst into the pavement before staggering back to his feet and falling again. I got out with the intention of helping, but only succeed in making a public spectacle. We were in a busy part of town, and people were gathering in bewilderment. Someone shouted, "Oh my God, how pissed are they?" To cut a long story short, I returned home with Dave, who refused to get out, and left Matt to be escorted home by the police. We pulled up outside my apartment. Driving was easier than walking, and I staggered inside, leaving Dave alone in the car. I can't remember the first hallucination, or even when I began to think the tea was working. Every notion of the existence of a past, present, future, or even Brugmansia tea was gone. It was now just an empty shell in a blurry dreamscape of delusional chaos. Extreme dissociation left emotional concepts totally void. This felt quite liberating because there was temporarily no more desire, craving, habit, or fear. I have a phobia of spiders, but felt nothing when hundreds of hand-sized spiders scurried down my wall and into my mold-covered bed. The Grim Reaper stood in the corner of my room. I slurred, "Hello," and he waved back at me. Demonic bats flew at my head, and imaginary glasses of water moved back as I went to grab them. Fleas covered my ceiling and hopped upside down as if gravity had been reversed. I knew what I saw was impossible, but it looked too real to be an illusion. I grabbed a fly spray bottle and began spraying flea-infested areas. The interesting thing was that individual fleas dropped to the floor and died after coming into contact with the spray. I could fully interact with every hallucination. I lied in bed for a while, watching white doves swoop back and forth, pecking one another. I'm not sure if they were fighting or playing. They morphed into huge spiders, then again into insects. I then noticed a red dog tearing a chicken's head off a few feet in front of me. I reached out to touch them, but my hand went straight through. At this point, the doorbell rang. It was Dave, who had been sat in the car for a long time, asking the whereabouts of Matt. Neither of us had any recollection of abandoning him. "Come in, I think he's upstairs," I said. We spent a while looking for him. "There's definitely someone else here," I declare. Dave replies that he's also seeing people and sits down in the living room. I grew exhausted and got back into bed, but I couldn't bring myself to sleep, so I began walking into different rooms. Then I would forget what I was doing in there. Occasionally, I passed Dave on the way to the toilet and asked him what he was doing in my apartment. Sometime later, he walked home. The following day, he told me that he kept talking to Matt, then realizing he wasn't there. Deep into the trip, I become aware that I can move inanimate objects without the use of physical contact. Telekinesis seemed perfectly normal in Brug reality. With only a pointed finger, I could shift dog toys from one side of the hallway to the other. Each toy had a colorful trail as it drifted across the carpet. 14 hours after ingestion, I went to sleep in the living room because there were too many insects in the bedroom. The following day, I had work as a dinnerman in a local school. Still very high, I tried to phone in sick, but as the secretary answered the phone, I forgot who I was talking to and what I was supposed to say. I mumbled something about a friend in intensive care. The secretary told me I had to come to work, so I turned up in dark sunglasses, which I wore all day. I was now suffering from severe perspective distortion, which really isn't good when you've got to serve dinner to 75 kids. The problem I had with imaginary objects moving away from me was now happening with real objects. I made a fool of myself and resigned. My eyesight gradually returned to normal after 2 days, and the hallucinations tapered off over the following 3. However, the trip was far from over. I was in a drunken stupor for weeks and began to hear voices. Whenever I smoked cannabis, things really spiraled out of control. I became delusional and paranoid. The voices multiplied and became even clearer, and my entire field of vision was overcome by kaleidoscope patterns. These effects were enjoyable for a week, then the fear set in. I tried to write it out, but felt like a complete mess, and my family kept telling me I had taken too many drugs. After 2.5 weeks of delusional paranoia, I decided to throw away all of my cannabis plants and 3 ounces of high-potency cannabis. Within a month of sobriety, I returned to normal. The one thing that really amazed me about Brugmansia was the longevity of the experience. Please use with caution. Death and Psychic Dinosaurs. I was on my way to drink at my friend C's house with some friends. I took a walk through the botanical gardens, sipping on a bottle of red wine. It was a nice night, and my mind was wandering the astral airwaves, mostly dwelling on my at-the-time obsession with the arcane and the surreal. I'm fairly certain that was a major factor in my decision to pick a couple of blood-red angel trumpets on my way. I had no plans to indulge at that point, but for whatever reason, it seemed like a good idea. At my friend's, we drank quietly and watched skateboarding videos. I'm not particularly close to these people. In fact, I wasn't particularly close to anyone at this point. Mostly, we just shared an interest in skateboarding. After an hour or so, we decided to go to a party at another friend's house a few minutes away. I wasn't enjoying this party, but I did the human thing and drank, smoked, and chattered on about whatever. At some point, a friend, who we'll call S, asked if I had any sweet drugs. As a joke, I presented him with my Datura flowers. He responded with a firm, "Fuck that," and we discussed my hellish experiences with the drug, concluding with the fact that I shouldn't do it again. But after a moment of introspection, I said to S, "Hey S, last trip," and munched down the 2 flowers and washed them down with red wine. I didn't place very much emphasis on this decision, but in hindsight, my life was lacking anything to give it structure or meaning, and I felt free to roam the world of chaos. However, my memory of the night has faded to dreams and confusion at this point, but I believe I sat quietly in a chair. I imagine this to be around midnight. During my first coherent memory, quite oblivious to the fact that I had lost my shoes and pants, I was trying to get into a flat I had lived at about a year ago, about half an hour away from the party. I had imagined my key in my hand, but it wasn't working at all. I soon noticed I had an older man in my company. "That's Olive's house," he told me, so I knocked loudly. A middle-aged lady answered, yelling at me to fuck off. My response was something along the lines of, "Sorry, I thought I lived here," and I wandered off. At this point, I had no idea I was under the influence, and it seemed like a reasonable mistake to make. The man looking for Olive disappearing wasn't particularly disconcerting either. After remembering where I lived, I started heading in that direction. I then experienced a frightening hallucination soon after. I was walking past an island on the road. There was a small sign on it, about waist high. In my questionable judgment, this sign was a small one-legged girl holding a sign. I thought it was very sweet that someone had found a job for her and started walking towards her. From the other side of the road, as if to mirror me, a dark and seemingly featureless man was walking towards her as well. He reached her before me and proceeded to viciously bind her with some kind of masking tape while she resisted and screamed a muffled cry. By the time I reached her, the attacker had vanished and the girl had become a street sign. I was convinced he had turned this girl into a street sign in the most inhumane manner. My next memory is reaching C's house. I have since been told that this was at about 7 a.m. C's flatmate D answered the door, waiting for a package. He then went and got C. I thought it was my package, but it was just me in fucking high pants, he said to him. In C's room, he very seriously told me that when we left his place, I still had pants on, but I wasn't convinced. I was lapsing in and out of believing this was my room and began leafing through his belongings. Apparently, I was talking very quietly and slowly. He told me later that I had asked to borrow his pants, and he said to ask D to borrow his. To this, I replied that would be opening a can of worms, and walked off. I'm surprised that in all my fucked upness, I can manage an offhand remark like that. D later said that after I left, I stood for like 15 minutes on their doorstep. I remember looking into their front window and seeing swirling, etheric forms, morphing very seamlessly from demon faces to small scenes. The walk home was terrifying. I lived almost an hour away and had to deal with the constant realization that I was fucked up, without pants, and totally delusional. I kept finding fingers in the pocket of my hoodie and mistaking the folds in the end of my sleeves for various items. I remember hoping to God my underwear was real. I also kept imagining my skateboard in my hands and would go to get on it and stumble. During a second hallucination, I seemed to be in an industrial, Eraserhead-esque area that I didn't recognize. I spotted out of the corner of my eye a chubby girl in a McDonald's uniform dancing. She noticed me, stopped suddenly, and started walking over very slowly before tripping. She started to scream, so I walked towards her, and she then started regurgitating a fetus. It sounded very painful. Before I reached her, the familiar featureless bastard emerged from nowhere, stomped the fetus, and gave the most evil glare. I ran away. I had never been so terrified before, and haven't been since. For the majority of the walk home, I felt extremely fucked. It was at this point that I began interacting with one of my hallucinations. I kept imagining the company of various people in my life, and I heard my name constantly. One of my friends tried to show me a dead body he'd found, but I didn't want to hear about it. He gave me a very hurt look as I walked away. I had a 5-second memory and walked around in a lot of circles. Someone mentioned that my attire was creative. I thought he was talking about my hoodie and mentioned how the hood did its job better than most. All the way home, I felt like I was hearing people's thoughts. There were usually a few trains of thought going through their heads at once. I could hear them notice me, then notice my lack of clothes, then decide to avoid my eyes. A few times, people's thoughts pointed out things about me that I hadn't noticed, like that I was wearing one sock. Eventually, I made it to the botanical gardens, and my trip took a turn for the better. I could hear the trees talking, and my hallucinatory friends stuck around long enough to have elaborate discussions. It still seemed normal for them to turn into trees, fence posts, etc. when they finished talking to me. I was phasing in and out of awareness of the fact that I was hallucinating, but I was always delusional. I thought I was being coherent to these totally real people I was seeing, but in reality, I was angrily yelling, "Leave me alone! I know you're not real!" to no one. It was raining by this point, and I noticed that the fallen leaves were set up to display intricate scenes, like a timeline of the universe. This was worth all of the terror and confusion of the trip, and I spent a very long time sitting in a puddle learning about the universe. Apparently, the dinosaurs had psychic battles and were all linked up in some kind of morphic field. This eventually killed them once they became competitive with each other within this field, destroying it from the inside. This was an amazing hallucination that still inspires me with its intricacy. Even now that I realize that it was not in fact a hippie sitting there and carefully arranging the leaves, the feeling of amazement that someone had that inhuman level of patience and attention to detail was so powerful that I still draw on it for artistic inspiration. As I was leaving the gardens, my friend tried to say hi to me, but I explained to him that he wasn't real and kept walking. I turned to look at him several times, expecting to see him turn into a rock, but for an expectingly long time, he just stared at me with puppy eyes. Eventually, he did turn into a rock. I was happy to be on the home stretch, as I lived about 10 minutes away. I was manifesting objects in my hand to an impressive standard of realism. I walked past a lady and heard her say something like, "Bit tired, huh?" I begged her pardon, and she said she didn't say anything. I said I must be tired and kept walking. Making it home was a huge relief. I was free to enjoy the visuals in peace, as my flatmates at the time were well used to my antics. As I wandered around the house, it was as if everything I'd ever experienced there was happening at once. I'd walk into the kitchen and find myself in some random conversation I'd had in that part of the kitchen. There were dozens of versions of each of my flatmates going about days they had in the past. Eventually, I went to bed and had a waking life series of vivid and surreal conversations with people I had and had not yet encountered. I talked with my older brother, who died about 3 years earlier, which was another thing that made the trip worthwhile. I don't remember what we talked about. I just remember being vaguely aware that he was dead and feeling very awkward about bringing it up. After an incredibly eventful sleep, I spent the next few days cleaning up the mess I made, finding new skate shoes, and getting a new phone. I'm afraid to ask the cops if anyone handed my jeans in, as my phone was full of dodgy text. Mostly, I spent the next week or so living in a haze. I think I blacked out for about 7 hours and tripped for well over 24 hours. I didn't feel normal for over a week. To those of you out there interested in exploring this world, I'd recommend doing something to stop yourself going wandering. I have no way of knowing what happened during my blackout, which makes me feel somewhat disturbed and frustrated. Some of the more frightening visions stayed with me for months, so it does help to be fairly mentally stable. It doesn't matter how experienced you are with hallucinogens. As far as I was concerned, the world was behaving strangely around me. For most of the trip, I had no idea I was fucked up, and the moments of clarity were few and far between. The best moments were in my bed exploring my mind. I'm still undecided about whether or not the experience was worth the terror, confusion, and the depression that followed, even for someone like me who, at the time, lived for that shit. But overall, I think the time spent in terror wasn't any more prominent than the time spent in awe. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Be careful. The terror. I was going through a bad time. My wife had left me. I was stuck with the kids. No money, no food, no transportation. I had used shamanic drumming before to discover certain things, and I decided to do it again, but with a little help. I had a large shrub of Brugmansia sanguinea I had grown from a cutting. I made a tea, and not knowing a proper dosage, guessed at 2 leaves and 2 reddish orange flowers. I went to bed and tried to do some drumming. After a while, I felt the drug coming on, quite strong, but for some reason, I fought it. I fell asleep. I had terrifying dreams of being chased by a demon who kept smashing my face into the projectors in a movie theater projection booth where I worked. I woke up at one point from pain as I ran into the kitchen counter at full speed, which smacked me down, and I crashed on my back on the hard floor. No hands to cushion me whatsoever. I gasped from the shock and pain and passed out again. That's all I remember. When I awoke the next morning, I felt very strange. There was blood on the sheets, my legs were cut up, some nasty cuts on my forehead. My son stood at the foot of the bed, staring at me. He looked at me strangely and said, "Dad, I think you need to come into the living room." I followed him and stared aghast at the carnage. A large plate glass window, about 4 feet by 8 feet, had been smashed. It was not safety glass, there were ominous daggers of glass. It seems I had gone through it, fortunately knees first.
or I would have been decapitated. I had torn the back door off its hinges. Same thing with the clothes dryer. "What happened?" I asked him. He said I went crazy during the night. They didn't know why. The 3 kids cowered in their room as I ran back and forth through the house, smashing full speed into walls, evidently at the same time as my dreams of being chased by the demon. I was yelling and saying strange things. I stood in the shower with my clothes on and wept. I seemed intent on destroying myself, and did the aforementioned damage to the window and door. I went to check myself in the mirror. I looked like a Martian. My blue-green eyes were completely black, like those guys infected by the alien virus in the X-Files, and I was cut up very badly. Do not try this stuff. Maybe under controlled circumstances, with an experienced shaman, it would be a different experience, but I could have been killed, and it was truly the most frightening experience of my life.
The trip that changed everything. Important note: I will state the dosage used, as I think it should be with experience reports. If you do get stupid thoughts, I ask you to give it another go very thoroughly. I would shoot myself without hesitation for a second instead of drinking the tea again. This is not a saying, but I really mean it. And important note: to my person. At that time, I weighed about 90 kilograms on 185 centimeters, and at the tender age of 17, I was by far the youngest in the group of a total 6 suicidals. I've got used to that term since then. Mentally, everything was great for me. Absolutely no problems, stress, or worries. I also managed to graduate with straight A's in school for the first time, which I really wanted to celebrate with something very special. It was a moment in my life where everything just seemed to go perfectly, which in my opinion is the basic requirement to come back from such a trip in one piece. At the time, me and my friends were just very curious and decided to have as much fun with drugs, that includes with control, winky face, as possible, and we wanted to try every drug at least once if possible. As a result, we were ultimately quite experienced with drugs. As such, experiments had to be well planned and considered. We weren't afraid of a shot of heroin and crystal, but we were very afraid of addiction and concentrated on other substances, mostly psychedelics. But then we really let it escalate and always pushed the limits to the full. In addition to cocktails made from ketamine, mushrooms, and LSD, really blatant effect if you can't throw up from them, there were also excessive doses of liquid LSD, which were in the around 1500 microgram range at our peak. Indescribable. You are nobody anymore, but simply free. Color. Since you don't even try such experiments, of course it dragged on for years, which slowly made us very familiar with psychedelics. At least that's what we believed. Annotation. I know very well that our drug use was absolutely excessive, and you can sometimes believe that I'm just telling shit. Actually, I didn't want to give any details about our consumer behavior. Not because of me, someone who is now trying to get rid of his body with LSD. But I think in this way, the image of people who engage in angel trumpets is simply perfectly rounded and perhaps serves as a deterrent. At that time, with the sometimes therapeutic and therefore extremely dangerous doses of LSD, we got to know the deepest, and by that, I really mean the deepest, abysses of ourselves, and yet we were caught freezing by the angels' trumpets. Preparation. By the way, that story was quite a while ago. I'm 33 today. Winky face. As a result, none of us need the internet, and cannot find anything about the dosage, and, above all, the dangers. Instead, we studied books, and asked around in our circle of acquaintances, hoping that an acquaintance of an acquaintance might know something about it. In the end, we were able to collect a lot of information, including some information on the dosage, and the claim that red angel trumpets are on the one hand stronger, and on the other hand, they cause fewer blackouts than the yellow ones. In addition, there was the tip that consumed with amphetamines, the blackouts are even lower, and you have fewer physical side effects. We just accepted that we couldn't check any of it anyways, and determined a dosage for ourselves. Whereby the word determined is absolutely ridiculous. In the end, we just guessed, and as I know exactly today, only barely escaped death. We also decided on a day where we would start on a Thursday, as Friday was a public holiday, and we therefore had enough buffer for the, as we believed, maximum of 3 days of effect. Here, we had chosen the apartment of a certain friend, because we would not be disturbed there, and if necessary, we could also go to a meadow or into the forest if we felt like it. Music, films, food, picnic equipment, the finest speed/amphetamine we can get, even pee buckets, and a lot more was organized beforehand. Then, there was also a friend of a friend who was supposed to take care of us. She was/is a nurse, and has taken care of us very often. So, she was extremely experienced and had seen everything, although she never did drugs herself. But since it was new territory for us, and we had very little information about the effect, we added another buddy to watch out. 2 trip sitters for 6 people out of control is far too few. I can guarantee you that. The search for the Angel's trumpets then got tight. The day X was firmly selected and cannot simply be postponed, so we drove through the area for days until we finally found her. Somehow, that turned out to be more difficult than expected, especially when you are looking for the red ones and need a sufficient amount for 6 people. Damn, when I look at the written text, I can tell that I'm extremely dissolute. I will try to describe this part as accurately and as truthfully, even if it's not really easy. You know for yourself that it is very difficult to find the right words for a trip, and that story was a long time ago. To top it off, there are heavy blackouts, which means that I can no longer remember a lot, which to be honest, was not that bad at all. So I will also rely on what I was told afterwards from our trip sitters, doctors, and the police. Day X. I was the first in the apartment because I was on vacation and the others still had to work. My colleague had prepared everything and also mixed some speed and some drinks, which would then be given to us by the trip sitters if we were not able to snort a line. Then he stole the Angel's trumpets from my grandma's garden and put them in the fridge for me so I could start cooking right away. As agreed by us, I calculated 3.5 red bells, seed pods, flowers, and leaves together per person. So I took 21 fresh bells, chopped them up slightly, and threw them into a pot with about 3 liters of water to boil. I wasn't sure if that was enough, so I let it cool a few times and boil it again so that the active ingredient is transferred correctly, and so that it's not destroyed by heat. After the tea was ready, I let it cool down, filtered it, and poured some sugar into it, because the tea smelled very abnormal and immediately made you gag. The sugar brought only a minimal improvement. We actually felt safe with the dosage. We heard from people who took 6 per person, and the trip went perfectly. We did speak with an individual who was sick as hell after 1 bell, but what could go wrong? We thought. We were already so far that we didn't even think of LSD with less than 10 tabs per person. I think I even literally said that back then. Give me a time machine, and I'll punch my face for it like I've never seen it before. Everyone else was there by now. We divided the tea by 6 and drank it on an empty stomach, with our noses blocked. The taste was just disgusting. Until today, more than 10 years later, I can't drink tea without having the taste back in my mouth immediately. My brain just won't forgive me. Then we started to slowly pull the speed in very small lines until a proper flash was built up. By the way, I can't say whether and how exactly the trip was influenced by the speed. About an hour after drinking, we had an incredibly dry mouth. Even after taking a sip, your mouth and throat were dry again within seconds. We also noticed that our pupils were slowly getting bigger. After about 2 hours from the start of drinking, the effects probably started to slowly pick up speed. My pupils were so extremely large that I was a bit scared. Nothing but black, like being a demon. The extreme thirst was still there, but the whole body, especially the face, tingled so extremely that we simply forgot the thirst. Over time, the tingling became sometimes very uncomfortable, because it felt like if the limbs had been pinched off for a long time. So, already from this point on, I could no longer give any time information. We just lost track of time, and the trip sitters were focused on us, so they couldn't say anything about it. We suspect that the peak came on after 4 to 5 hours. At least from then on, the hallucinations were fully there. We just didn't know it. By the way, we're not talking about LSD-like effects, but about correct and absolutely blatant hallucinations, where you don't have the slightest chance to differentiate between imagination and reality. A few friends came to visit because they were interested in the effect. We chain smoked one cigarette after another, talking to them. According to the trip sitters, some had their cigarette out and they drew on it anyway, while others had nothing in their hands, but always led them towards their mouths. But the best thing was that we never had anyone over. We all imagined the conversation, each for himself. Today we know that we have imagined different people, siblings, work colleagues, etc. in different numbers, so we play perfectly together. So that 6 of us had an almost identical hallucination at the same time and had a conversation that actually made no sense to us. The trip sitters wanted to be on the safe side and began to explain the facts to us, so that we could understand that a lot was already not real and that we can get things under better control. The only problem was that none of us reacted to it, as we somehow only paid attention to one another and couldn't talk to anyone else, except the imaginary people. After drinking, the trip sitters weren't present in any of my memories, but apparently no one was surprised that they were simply gone. During this period of time, I remember many other logical things. For example, that I kept dropping my cigarette, which was no longer there when I picked it up, or dirt on my clothes, which was completely gone after wiping over it, or that I drank and swallowed from a bottle where the lid was still on after removing it. There were quite a few such little things. Still, I think at absolutely no time did I notice that it was a hallucination or would have suspected it. On the other hand, I was just, with a slightly muddy/blown head, most likely like on too much weed, in a completely different world. In this world, I was no longer aware that I had taken heavy drugs and that everything was so different as a result of that. So you are somehow mentally limited and can no longer properly be aware of the effects. Well, this apparently dragged on for a while. I don't know for sure, since I already had blackouts. But at some point, it was probably very quiet around us, so that the trip sitters could take turns to sleep for a little. We were on the other hand lively, because of the speed maybe, but completely withdrawn and lost in thought. However, we were always able to take a bottle on our own and drink it when necessary, but none of us can remember it. For the trip sitters, however, everything seemed to be normal and calm. So from that point on, the situation escalated incredibly quick. Bad trip. It was already Friday and deep into the night, so one day was completely wiped out for me. When a trip sitter noticed that one of my colleagues hadn't had a drink for hours, he was worried and really just wanted to help him. So he got involved in the trip for the first time. It sucked at the very beginning. I don't know how it would have gone if he hadn't done anything. You might think everything would have gone well, but I think the poison would have slowly destroyed our bodies. He tried to convince him that he should have a drink, but he didn't react a bit. So he woke up the nurse so that he could have support. She tried the same thing, but there was absolutely no response from him. Somehow she touched him and noticed that he felt extremely hot and said to the other sitter that they had to call a doctor immediately because his body temperature was well over 40 degrees Celsius, and he seemed to be burning. The moment she said the words, "burn up," my colleague jumped up and screamed that it was terribly hot, that he was on fire right now and doesn't want to die. I guess that screaming woke us all up in that moment. At least we can all remember that moment. One of them just didn't stop screaming and started taking his clothes off because he was so hot. Then, now completely naked, he took a bottle from the table and tipped it over himself to probably extinguish himself. Then he tried to escape outside because it was cooler there. The guards immediately grabbed him and locked him up so that he could no longer move. He always screamed like, "I can't get out of here, and that's why I'm gonna burn." That triggered the next buddy to have a panic attack. He was afraid that he would not be able to leave the apartment like the first and tried to open the locked door. When that didn't work, he ran into a corner of the room, took a very hard run, and jumped with full force against the door and then lay in front of it. He had broken his shoulder and began to scream in pain, or rather whine. Both trip sitters were in total panic and completely overwhelmed. The guy wanted to calm things down and made the most fatal mistake. He dragged the one who appeared to be burned into the laundry room by the foot and locked him in there. He wanted to make sure that he didn't get injured while running away, and also wanted to put him out of action, since I and 3 others were in the room and there were only 2 of them.
he and a 45-kilogram nurse. Just try to imagine what it looked like for us, because as I said before, none of us could hear or see the two trip sitters. Because of this, and because of the drug itself, my image of this action became absolutely horrifying. I could see someone screaming and being pulled back into the dark room by some kind of magic. Then, the door closed by itself, and we heard knocking and screaming that he couldn't see anything and couldn't get out. Not to forget, of course, that it still burns, and he will die in the same way. I immediately got an unimaginably terrible feeling. Many memories came up from my life, and I saw each of them totally negative and black. I had the feeling that everything I had ever done, seen, or experienced was just bad. I knew there couldn't be anything worse than that. So it would be better for me to just die, which I was waiting for. But then I realized that I couldn't die, and I had to stay that way forever, which made it even worse. You just can't put this moment into words. I think you have to experience it to understand it. However, I wouldn't wish that to anyone. Dude, I wouldn't even do that to Hitler. That probably only lasted a few seconds. To me, it seemed as if it had always been that way, because everything in my past was bad, black, and negative. I knew exactly that it's not real. But now that I think about it again, I have every single and even the smallest detail in my head. Also, consider how long it was. This feeling stopped when someone else jumped up and interrupted my thoughts. He wanted to prevent himself from being dragged into this dark room, and then also saw someone lying badly injured in front of the door whining that we would never come out again. According to reports, the sitter grabbed his arm immediately. We didn't see her, but my colleague grabbed a bottle from the table and waved it around in panic. It hit the sitter in the head, causing him to be dazed for a while because the bottle was made of glass. Really very stupid to have glass bottles at the start of such a journey, although if we look at the rest, it fits perfectly. My colleague then went back a little, took the sofa as a staircase, and jumped through the window. It was very lucky for him that we were on the first floor. He stayed in the bushes in front of the window, but had many and some very deep cuts through the glass and lost a lot of blood. A jump like that just doesn't go like it does in the movies, believe me. For me and the other two, the jump was rather suboptimal because we immediately used the window to escape. The nurse immediately called the ambulance and the police so they could find us. From then on, my memory became very sketchy again. I still know that I was panicking about something. I didn't know what it was, but still, I ran for my life. I fell on my face a few times. I can still remember that. But apart from the falls, the race, and the incredible fear, I know absolutely nothing anymore. I was found shivering in a meadow by the police station an hour after jumping out the window. Another ran into the street and was hit by a car. They found the third one after 4.5 hours, sitting quietly on a bench. We don't know anything about it anymore. For me, the memory doesn't start again until Sunday morning on the intensive care station at the hospital. This time, more than a whole day was gone, but it also was the last blackout. In the hospital, we were given an antidote and other medication, but this did not make the effects go away. I continued to feel very drowsy and had hallucinations until Tuesday lunchtime. Especially when I was in the hospital, I kept giving myself a cigarette. The resume, sorted by me subjectively, according to severity. Me. For me, every tea, also, for example, iced tea, if I know that it is tea, tastes like angel trumpets. I'm the only one who feels that way, and the psychologist at the time called it a temporary trauma. I didn't care anymore because I never liked tea and never had any tea. I remember the fear, and that something was haunting me. In addition to this, I had an absolutely bad and negative feeling. Since I know for sure that none of it was real, I did not suffer any psychological problems, and I was never in therapy. Oh yes, I had a broken nose, which probably happened when I fell while running away. Colleague 1. It was him who was found on the bench. He needs glasses since that day, became extremely nearsighted, and can remember several bad things. But he gets along very well with that, doesn't need a psychologist, and has never been in therapy. He is the only one I still have fleeting contact with, and know that he is doing very well. Colleague 2. He was the third who escaped out the window with me. He can remember several bad things. He's now coping with that very well, but had to be treated for a long time. In addition, he was hit by a car while fleeing when he ran across the street and broke his knee. Haven't been in contact for a few years. Recently, he was feeling very good mentally, although he reported chronic pain in his knee. Colleague 3. The one who tried to break the door open with his shoulder can remember several nasty things. He coped with this for a while, after a long period of treatment. As I said, he broke his shoulder from the force, but it healed without any problems. Haven't been in contact for a few years. I know he was undergoing treatment again, and when we last met, he acted kinda strangely and seemed kinda jumpy. According to him, he has been doing fine for a while. He just somehow got problems with his pupils and can therefore see very poorly in the dark. Colleague 4. Jumped through the window and left some scars, one of them in the middle of the face. I only had contact with him for a short time after that. He got extreme problems with his eyes, had extreme anxiety, especially in the dark, and was a completely different person to me. Already in the hospital, when we were feeling better, there was somehow nothing left of him. Also, Colleague 1 said that he probably never returned. A few months later, I learned from a relative that he was blind in one eye and that one of his heart valves was no longer closing properly. According to doctors, it is caused most likely by the poison. He was significantly smaller and lighter than the rest of us, but had insisted on the same amount of tea for everyone. Colleague 5. The one who believed he was being burned and was dragged into a dark room and locked up. His parents blamed me for everything and never told me how he was doing. The others didn't even ask. Since the 6 of us were the best colleagues at the time, and I was extremely worried, I tried hard to find out something. Because of the confidentiality obligation, this is hardly possible. I only found out that shortly after we were admitted, when we were still in the blackout, he was transferred directly to another clinic. He was directly briefed into a psychiatric clinic for an unknown time span. I couldn't find out more. This is my story. You can see that we were all really badly hit. A couple of us were just a little more lucky than the others who completely crashed. I actually got better again pretty quickly, so that after a long time, I was even able to laugh again. I've studied, found a good job, got married, and am aiming for a family after my house is finished next year. However, you have probably noticed that the smileys are less at the end. The feelings from back then were just too blatant and often present, which I have already described. Unfortunately, there is also something very current. I notice that I always see bad things in the dark. My wife says that my pupils are somehow larger than usual. I already have an appointment with a specialist. Let's see what comes out. Unfortunately, hardly anyone heard of our experience at the time, as nobody wants to hear such stories, and it did not become public. I hope, however, that I have been able to catch up on this with this report, and that it remains online as a warning to others. Furthermore, I switched back to the read-only mode, and will definitely not teach anyone more. If this report is not enough for you, and you want to test lower doses, then it's up to you. But please don't run in front of my car one day. Drug use after. Of course, everyone immediately advised me against any consumption, but I knew exactly what drugs I can still afford from this point on. Logically, psychedelics are no longer one of them. The danger is too great that memories, I am thinking in particular of what was forgotten from the blackout phases, or even a flashback, could come back. That's why I would be afraid of going on another trip, which is a bad start for psychedelics. Although I don't really like them, and used to take them more often for the purpose of mixed consumption. Today, I rarely allow myself a little weed plus MDMA, but I don't dare to get any closer to my psyche. Oh man, you don't believe how much I miss the LSD. But maybe at some point, if it should become legal, I'll have a psychologist repair my brain with it. That's the end of my story. I hope you liked it.